Welcome. My name is Angel Wood, and this is Crime of the Truest Kind. Let's go. Episode 2, the continuation of the Whitey Bulger saga. And later on, I talked to Dave Wedge, co-author of Hunting Whitey, the new book about, the hunt for Whitey Bulger after he took off from Boston in 1995 and became America's most wanted fugitive. I read it in about a day and a half when I was on vacation in Maine. It helped. I was in a hammock by the lake. We will talk about all the discoveries that he and his co-author Casey Sherman learned when they were doing research for the book. Thanks to everybody who downloaded last week's debut episode. I'm always impressed when there's one download. And if there's more than one, well, lucky me. I am finding my pace and my groove and my style. I'm feeling okay about it. Things can only get better. All right, let's talk Whitey Bulger, America's most notorious mobster. By the end of 1994, the heat was on. Word got to Whitey Bulger that an indictment was coming down. Tipped off by the corrupt FBI agent John Connolly, Associate Kevin Weeks delivered the message on a snowy night in Boston's Copley Square, surrounded by holiday shoppers. Sealed indictments had come from the Department of Justice, and the FBI was set to make arrests during the holidays. 2 days before Christmas, Whitey and his longtime girlfriend, Teresa Stanley, set off on the lam. He had long been preparing for life as a fugitive. Bulger and his right-hand man, Stevie Flemmi, had been spending time leading up to the news of the indictment, flying to overseas destinations, planting money and documents around the world. It's something Whitey had been working on for years. He had established a new identity for the express purpose of running. As Thomas Baxter, he had a driver's license, a social security card, and several other fake legal documents. With safe deposit boxes stuffed with cash and jewelry and passports, in locations across North America and Europe, including Florida and Oklahoma and Montreal, Dublin, London, and Venice, he wanted to be ready to go on short notice. The couple spent Christmas in New York, then made their way down the East Coast, landing in New Orleans for New Year's Eve. Then to Florida to hide out in the winter warmth. Everybody from Massachusetts loves Florida. I don't know why. I mean, I love Florida. I do. I just don't know why everybody from Massachusetts wants to go to Florida. Must be the oranges. I don't know. It's a thing. I don't know. It took just 2 weeks for Stanley to figure out that she did not like life on the run. She had too many attachments, and she missed her family. And Whitey had no intention to ever return to Boston. So they agreed to drive her back to Massachusetts. By the time they'd hit Connecticut, the feds had picked up Stevie Flemmi. The FBI has already raided Teresa's house on Silver Street in South Boston, as well as a second house in Quincy. That's the home of Whitey's longtime girlfriend, Catherine Gregg. Theirs is a long and storied relationship, and Teresa Stanley was considered his common-law wife. Kind of an old-fashioned term if you ask me. You didn't. Catherine was the attractive divorced woman, more than 20 years younger, and she wanted more of Whitey than she had been getting. Her wish was about to come true. As Whitey dropped off Teresa Stanley at a restaurant in Hingham on the South Shore, Kevin Weeks was picking up Catherine to deliver her to Whitey at Carson Beach in Southie. In rapid turnover, Whitey had a new traveling companion, and the next leg of the adventure began. Life on the run would be all but too new from that point forward. Whitey Bulger and Catherine Gregg left Boston for the final time in January 1995. Heading south once again, it would be the last time Bulger would be in his hometown until his capture 16 years later. The two were set to portray themselves as a regular retired couple from up north longing for southern warmth. In 1996, Whitey Bulger and Catherine Gregg made their way down to the Gulf Coast of Louisiana. As Thomas Baxter and Helen Marshall, they spent months in a 2-bedroom apartment in the fishing village of Grand Isle. The two did their best to fit in an area with a very different pace than the cities they'd become accustomed to. There, they befriended a local family over their shared love of dogs. Catherine had left her 2 poodles, Nikki and Gigi, behind when she took off. I wonder how many times she regretted that decision. Catherine was known to be the social one of the couple, sometimes too social, as we will learn, and struck up a conversation with town worker Penny Gautreaux and her son Glenn Jr., who had 2 black labs. Glenn, whose nickname was Bruiser, ended up calling them Uncle Tom and Aunt Helen. They'd shared dinners with the family, including Penny's husband, Glenn Sr., and their other kids, something Whitey missed from his days back home. While they had a genuine fondness for one another, the family did see a darker side of Whitey and Catherine's relationship. He would often snap at Catherine for her attention, and she would come running, eager to serve. He treated her like a servant. For all of his obvious defects, Whitey was generous to the family. They didn't have much, and Whitey and Catherine seemed happy to help. The two had become surrogate grandparents, paying for medical expenses and groceries, covering vet bills for the sick dogs, getting things that sometimes Glenn Jr. just looked at in passing at a store. Whitey would buy them for him. He later said that he had spent $40,000 on the family while in Louisiana. Back in Boston, the authorities paid a visit to Teresa Stanley with plans to work on her to get info about their escape and give up Whitey's location. So far, she had refused to talk, and the Bureau was in need of a strategy to get to her. After all, she must have been pissed off that she was left with no income stream after years of Bulger money, and she learned how quickly Whitey had taken up with Catherine Gregg. FBI agent Charlie Gianturco, a Massachusetts guy, who'd grown up in nearby Chelsea and spent the better time of a decade in New York City chasing names like Gotti and Gambino, was assigned to work the case. After a few meetings with Stanley, Gianturco learned a number of things, including the bombshell they needed, that he was using the alias Thomas Baxter. The real Thomas Baxter was a small-town guy from Woburn outside the city who died in the 1970s. Whitey somehow got his hands on the man's license and worked a connection inside the RMV to get his photo on the dead man's ID. No one at the registry would talk to the FBI. The Bulgers saw to that. Agents believed Whitey's all-powerful brother Billy was behind the brick wall they faced trying to get information from the Registry of Motor Vehicles. After a good deal of research by the Bureau, they discovered that a Grand Marquis registered to Thomas Baxter of Selden, New York, at an address of the home that belonged to a cousin of Kevin Weeks. That boat of a car had been sighted in the Midwest and down south, most recently in Louisiana. Agents were sent to stake out the address, and after 4 long months of nothing, the car one day appeared. The reason? Whitey needed something more dependable with less miles, so he sent it up north to be stored in the driveway in Selden. The feds surveilled the home from a neighbor's yard under the guise of investigating the recent TWA Flight 800 disaster that crashed over Long Island, killing 230 people on board. Agents were all over this area of New York at the time, so it seemed plausible. For days and weeks, that old Grand Marquis sat. The only action it saw was the owner of the house coming out to start it, run it for a few minutes, and go back in. After a 41-day wait, very random number, the man got in and drove it to work. The man, they learned, was the husband of Weeks' cousin, and he didn't seem to be involved with any of the gang's business. The agents followed him and waited until the man concluded his workday as not to embarrass him at home or in his place of business, and approached him as he walked through the parking lot. Agent Gianturco showed his badge and a wanted poster with Whitey Bulger's face on it, and said, "That is not a good guy." The man's response, "Who, Tom?" The man took a closer look as Giancarlo told him about Whitey's rap sheet. He was stunned and explained to the agents that he'd been told that Tom Baxter was a longshoreman who needed an address for his mail and paid the family to store his car. The man cooperated and turned the car over, swearing total secrecy to the agents. The Grand Marquis was brought to the Nassau County Police Department for holding while Gianfranco drove back to Boston. His plan was to bring a mechanic and a forensic analyst he trusted back to New York for a complete forensic inspection with the hope of finding something, anything that could lead them to Whitey Bulger. As they took the car apart, they eventually found a crumpled piece of paper under an interior rug. It turned out to be a receipt for items purchased at a Walmart in Galliano, Louisiana. And next to no time at all, the agents were on a flight to Louisiana to case the town. The plainness of this place they found was confusing. What would bring Whitey Bulger and Catherine Gregg here? Gianfranco was tipped off by a local agent of the resort town 52 minutes down into the barrier island called Grand Isle, where the agents took turns staking out the area for sightings of the couple. Thing is, word had already gotten to Whitey. Kevin Weeks had paid a visit to a visibly nervous, chain-smoking Teresa Stanley. He pressed her for her involvement with a new boyfriend, Bulger rival Alan Thistle, telling her he was using her to get to Whitey. Too late, she confessed that she had already spilled to the federal agents. She told him she had given up his Tom Baxter identity. Weeks flew into action, paying a visit to Stevie Fleming in the Plymouth jail, telling him he had to contact Whitey with his finding. This wasn't ever part of the plan. It was always Whitey who'd reach out to Kevin Weeks if he needed anything. He did reach Whitey, who immediately went to work on their next move. He needed Weeks to contact his brother Jackie Bulger to pose as him in a new set of photos in order to get a new ID. Thomas Baxter was dead. Again. They left the sleepy barrier island town, stopping only to say goodbye to Bruiser and his family that they'd become close with. Whitey knew they'd never see him again, and that he'd be long gone by the time they learned who he really was. The feds moved through town, talking to anyone and everyone who might have known Tom Baxter and Helen Marshall. Eventually, they got to the Gautreaux family. None of them believed he was who the agent said he was. The family refused to give them any information at all. Whitey Bulger's kindness to them had paid off in loyalty and secrecy. Kevin Weeks had 2 more meetings with Whitey Bulger after they left Louisiana. First, they met in Chicago, where Weeks delivered the photos Jackie Bulger had taken to be used for new fake IDs. Whitey thought they were all wrong. The fake mustache Jackie wore wasn't anything like the thin line Whitey was wearing over his lip now. They decided to stage new photos, buying a Polaroid camera and holding an impromptu shoot in their hotel room. Kevin Weeks was now tasked to return to Boston and get 4 new IDs, while Whitey and Catherine caught an Amtrak train back to Penn Station in New York City. Weeks was fearful and paranoid now more than ever, and planned to send someone else to deliver the new IDs to Manhattan. Whitey did manage to convince Kevin Weeks to meet him in their usual spot at the Lions, outside the main branch of the public library. After the meeting, Weeks boarded a train back to Boston South Station. It would be the last time he would see Whitey Bulger, until he testified against him at trial years later. Federal agents continued to monitor all friends and family. They had 2 hits, one from Louisiana and one from Mississippi. Seems as though the couple were hiding their way through the Deep South. They made their way back to Chicago to visit some old prison pals of Whitey's. He was keen on his Alcatraz mates. After all, it was his alma mater. Seeing these men was a lot like seeing old college friends. After that, the 2 boarded a train headed west. Where would they go? Whitey considered Washington State, on the border, but not over the border. Maybe there was some safety in that, but it was too rainy for his old bones. San Francisco was a consideration. He'd get a good look at his old home, Alcatraz. The train pulled into Union Station in Los Angeles, and the couple found a quiet motel room nearby to contemplate what was next. Whitey rolled out a map and studied it for hours. Sleep did not come easy for him. The acid tests he was subjected to really fucked him up, clearly. Whitey was woken up with a jolt on day one by helicopters overhead. His panic kicked in, but subsided once he learned that the O.J. Simpson civil trial for the murders of Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldsman were taking place at the courthouse a few blocks away. Didn't matter. He told Catherine to pack her stuff, and they were out. Next stop was Venice Beach, a good spot to lay low that was filled with hippies, surfers, and a variety of weirdos. Once Whitey Bulger and Catherine Gregg arrived in Southern California, they appeared to have lived a relatively uneventful existence. They settled in plain sight as Charlie and Carol Gasco in a modest rent-controlled apartment for $1,145 a month, number 303 on the third floor of the Princess Eugenia, a 3-story building 3 blocks from the Pacific Ocean. There were telltale signs of what neighbors would later learn. Once said the old man, remember, Whitey Bulger was well into his 60s when he took off, would sit up all night watching through binoculars from the balcony. There was a handwritten sign on the apartment door that read, "Please do not knock." This was to not disturb Whitey as he slept during the day in a blacked-out back bedroom. Over the years, Carol, a.k.a. Catherine, would befriend people in the neighborhood. They were known for feeding homeless animals. They seemed to have coexisted, not unlike other couples their age, despite that Whitey was considerably older than Catherine. He had a messy, cluttered room. They lived simply. They paid for everything in cash. He'd buy cheap tube socks and stretch them out over plastic bottles. They bought in bulk. 5 pairs of sneakers were found lining the top of a shelf in Whitey's room, including 4 identical pairs, white with blue stripes. Catherine Gregg was known to buy months and months of contact lenses in advance. Most people found that odd. Joshua Bond, the building's general manager and Whitey and Catherine's neighbor at the time they lived there, said they were known in the neighborhood as the couple that always wore white. Whitey was quiet and kept to himself. In fact, anytime Catherine was questioned with where Whitey was, there was always some new sort of excuse. Bonds had no idea who Whitey was, like most people outside of New England, despite having attended Boston University a few years earlier. How Whitey Bulger spent those years as a fugitive is both fascinating and sad. He was never free. He was always looking over his shoulder, waiting for the feds or a hitman to come. Federal agents searched for him everywhere. They followed leads all over the world. It was always believed he had left the country, made it to Mexico or some Central American coastal town. Stories of the FBI not wanting to find Bulger have plagued the Bureau for years, and some of the decisions they made over those 16 years indicate maybe that is true. By 2010, fresh eyes were put on the case. At the FBI's Boston headquarters, Special Agents Noreen Gleason and Rich Tian were busy building a command post. With a new team of investigators, they needed a fresh approach. All the attempts to find Whitey over the years failed. The focus now would shift to Catherine Gregg. What it came down to was finding the doctor who performed her plastic surgery years earlier. They placed ads in some trades and located the right office. The agents were able to get records and photographs. You imagine how ecstatic they were with that. Up until this point, they'd never seen clear and resolute photos of Catherine Gregg. Using this new information, the agents had a PSA produced and bought airtime during daytime television that appealed to women. The plan was to suggest Catherine might be in danger, to rally female viewers to come to her aid. The high-resolution photos of Gregg appeared, and a reward of $100,000 flashed on the screen. Here is the audio from the very PSA that aired on June 21st, 2011, 24 hours before the capture and arrest of Whitey Bulger and Catherine Gregg.
This is an announcement by the FBI. Have you seen this woman? The FBI is offering $100,000 for tips leading to Catherine Gregg's whereabouts. These photos are from the early 1990s. Gregg has had plastic surgeries. She is wanted for harboring James Whitey Bulger, a fugitive on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. 60-year-old Gregg is the girlfriend of 81-year-old Bulger. He has a violent temper and is charged with 19 murders. Call the tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI.
Intense, right? Well, Catherine Gregg's face was everywhere. It generated major news and the major kind of energy the case needed. Agents' phones were ringing off the hook from media requests. Calls kept coming in, but there was one in particular that stood out. Agent Tian recognized 3 different inquiries that came from the same caller. A woman from Reykjavik, Iceland, named Anna Bjorndur. Thank you, I tried. I'm very sorry. She told him a great deal of specifics. They live in the Princess Eugenia Apartments in Santa Monica, California. They called themselves Charlie and Carol Gasco. She knew for certain it was them. She had befriended Gregg over their mutual love of the stray cat named Tiger. She had even provided an actual location and a name, which differentiated this tip from any other that came in. Agents reviewed the federal law enforcement database and found Carol and Charles Gasco living at the Santa Monica address. Stranger still, the couple had no birth dates listed, no social security numbers listed, no California driver's licenses or state ID cards listed. They were ghosts. The Boston Bureau office contacted the Los Angeles office to coordinate the capture. It is intense and plays out in the new book, Hunting Whitey, by Casey Sherman and Dave Wedge. I will talk to Dave Wedge at the end of this episode. It's there where they are ultimately captured on June 22nd, 2011. I will always remember the day they were caught. It was my birthday. It was sort of a gift. It was very big news in and around the city of Boston. Some people went a little crazy. Some people celebrated. Remember, he was the most wanted, and he is responsible for killing a lot of people. Okay, I talked to Dave Wedge about his research into the hunt for Whitey Bulger, why it took so long, and what those years were like before his capture and his murder in prison. Yes, Whitey Bulger's story does not end well. Please keep in mind when you listen to this interview that it is for the book release, Hunting Whitey, by Casey Sherman and Dave Wedge, co-authors. Dave and I are friends, so despite the fact that we are talking about a very serious subject, it's not a totally straight interview. Oh, and it is on Zoom, and I do apologize for the less than optimal audio quality.
I'm a Bostonian, like you. You grew up here.
Yep.
Whitey Bulger has this air, this Whitey Bulger legend here, and I don't know where it came from. Why is he so celebrated? The guy is a vicious murderer.
It's not so much a celebration as it is an obsession. And I think people are like mystified and, they want to know everything they can find out about Whitey and like why he kind of ran this area and why they need to know about him. And like new people that move to Boston, they hear about Whitey Bulger and the Winter Hill Gang and all this crap. And they want to know like, why was this guy such a mythological figure? Mm-hmm. And I think part of the reason we wrote this book was to kind of break down that mythology. We try to show, like, he was a criminal, and he ran criminal enterprises, and he had the whole area wired, but guess what? He got taken down, and here's how he got taken down. And we tell that whole story. So I think that's an important part of the story, too, because I think a lot of people that know about Whitey or think about Whitey, they think Boston is like this horrible, corrupt place where, like, Whitey Bulger ran it, and it's never changed, and it's just this scummy city where all these white Irish criminals run shit, and it's not the case. He got taken down, and he got taken down hard.
Do you think the press had a lot to do with that mystique?
I do. So there were a few reporters that and columnists in the city that really kind of perpetuated it. And the truth of the matter is that Whitey Bulger was just a liar. His brother kind of perpetuated that. And, you know, some people in the media kind of carried the water for him and perpetuated this myth that, like, he was this guy that kept drugs out of Southie, and could be further from the truth. And we lay it out plainly in the book. And, you know, forget about the 19 murders and all the people that went to jail. Whitey Bulger and his drug dealing, his cocaine trafficking and his heroin trafficking destroyed countless families in the Boston area and all of New England, really. And there's a lot of kids who went to jail. Parents lost their children, ODs, suicides, things like that. It was all because of the drugs that Whitey brought into the neighborhood. So it was really a bunch of bullshit.
He got involved into more international waters when he was running guns to the IRA.
You know, that's a funny situation, Angel, because, you know, that was actually one of the noble things that Whitey did do. Like, he was trying to fund a political cause that he believed in, and whether or not, whichever side you were on in that war in Ireland, he was actually running guns for the IRA so that they could be involved in this, you know, civil war that was going on in Ireland. It wasn't a great idea, but at least in that case, he had a principle. But in Boston, he had no principle. His principle in Boston was money, because he was destroying the neighborhoods that he lived in and worked in: Charlestown, Boston, East Boston, Chelsea, Quincy, all those neighborhoods. You know, going down the South Shore. You won't meet someone that grew up in this area that doesn't have a story about someone that Whitey Bulger knew, or someone that their life was destroyed by. Someone, you know, it's just the way it is. So the IRA situation was interesting because, at least in my opinion, he at least had a dog in the fight. You know,
that's an interesting take on it, because I wasn't thinking that.
I think about these things a lot.
In your research, you and Casey Sherman, your co-writer, but what are some of the big things that he wasn't charged with? I read about the arsons around busing.
Well, yeah, I mean, but that was earlier than those indictments. You know, those happened in the 70s, 1970s. Yeah. Make no mistake, like, we talk about systemic racism now, and Whitey Bulger was in the middle of that fight. He was one of the guys throwing those Molotov cocktails. The famous picture of the guy stabbing the guy with the American flag that Stanley Foreman took of Channel 5, Pulitzer Prize-winning photo, like, Whitey knew those guys. Like, those were his people. Like, he was definitely a racist, and we lay it all out in the book, you know, about all his racism. There's many examples, even at the end of his life, where he talked really negatively, to say the least, about Obama. Talked about Mexicans and immigrants and all that. So he was a bad guy, and that's just who he was. And unfortunately, some of his personality has stained Southie, and it shouldn't, because most of Southie is good people. You know, they're just hardworking. You know, most of them are good people. Whitey definitely, like, used that to his advantage, and, you know, he would exploit the crime and all that.
I want to talk to you a little bit about Billy Bulger's involvement.
You know, that's up for debate, but, you know, it's, as we wrote in the book, it's strange credulity that Billy Bulger did not know where his older brother was. And if you read the book closely, you'll read between the lines and you'll understand that the FBI was very clear that they questioned the family hard. They weren't happy with the answers they got. They drilled Billy Bulger many times, and they believed that he did not tell them the truth, and they wanted to build a case against him. And they believed that he should have been charged with perjury, obstruction of justice, aiding and abetting, those sort of things. They were never able to build that case. Now, today, Billy Bulger is a 87-year-old man, and he lives in South Boston, the same house where they grew up. So
still has a hell of a pension,
the biggest in Massachusetts history. Billy Bulger, you know, I knocked on his door and interviewed him for this book, and he was very forthcoming, let me in the house. You know, his wife was there. I talked to his wife as well, and I was very appreciative that he let us into his life. But I also interviewed Billy Bulger, 15 years prior, and I always found him to be evasive. You know, he was never very honest. Mm-hmm. You know, he would never answer questions in a straightforward manner. If you asked him a question like, hey, did you know where your brother was? His answer was always, well, my brother went a different way than I did. And that's fine. You know, the FBI knows that there's about a 0 chance that Billy didn't know where he was.
I realized that Teresa Stanley died a few years ago, and I didn't really even know this until very recently.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, she died in, I guess, back in 2012. She never gave him up either, huh? he dropped Teresa off, turned around, went and picked up Catherine, and left Teresa with nothing.
So one of the interesting things about this story that I think, and we get into it in this book, is that he left with Teresa Stanley, went for like a couple of months, brought her home and dropped her off, and there was no one sitting on her house. And everybody in the law enforcement community knew that Teresa Stanley was Whitey Bulger's girlfriend. Mm-hmm. So you would think that there would be law enforcement sitting on her house waiting for her, or waiting for people to come and go, Kevin Weeks, Steve Fleming, whoever it might be, someone to come and go from that house and talk to someone there. And they didn't do it. She came home from that little sojourn that they took, and it was a couple of months. He brought her home, and it took months before anyone interviewed her from law enforcement. And it ended up being the FBI that talked to her. And she ducked and dodged. But if they had interviewed her on like day one or the moment she got home, maybe they got some more information, and maybe they would have grabbed Whitey quicker. A lot of the folks that I know involved in this case in journalism and law enforcement and other places believe had they interviewed Teresa Stanley quicker, they would have found Whitey long before they did.
Because she would have been super pissed off when she figured out what happened.
She was mad, but she was also, she also may have been rattled, by just getting home. Like, well, what's going on? That sort of thing. Yeah. But the bottom line is they let her sit and marinate for, 2-3 months, and then they finally came to her, and they didn't even press her hard then. Again, when you read this book, you'll learn that, those early days of the investigation were completely botched and mishandled, and the FBI probably wasn't that interested in finding Whitey Bulger in those early days. There was a change in the mid-2000s when a new regime came in, as we talk about in the book, with Noreen Gleason and Tommy Mack and Phil Torsney and all these fugitive hunters that, finally said, it's time to find this guy.
She pulled all of the right people into that team that finally figured it out. And it's really incredible how they actually got them.
Noreen Gleason comes on the case in, I think, 2004 or 5, and she's brought in, and she's made the, the head of the Whitey Bulger task force. And in the media here, we have seen this story before. We've heard it before, we're going to get him. He's our priority. But remember, we had a break in this because after 9/11, it was like Whitey didn't matter.
He got bumped from the top of the list.
And that went on for 4 or 5 years. But around 5, 6, 7 of 2000, Noreen Gleason's brought in, and she's tasked with finding him. And the ASAC, the agent in charge, says, do you really want to find him? She says, yes. All right, put together a team. So she did. And she brought in some of the best fugitive hunters in the FBI. He was at that point number one. Bin Laden was dead, so he's the number one most wanted fugitive in America. And she said, you know what, we're going about this all wrong. We need to find her, not him. That's when she went to the plastic surgeons. They actually, what they did that was genius was they put an ad, plastic surgeon, trade magazines, and they put her picture in, and they said, have you ever seen this woman? If you ever treated her, get in touch. The plastic surgeon that treated Catherine Gregg actually happened to have a brother who was in the FBI. I want to get Whitey Bulger. Yeah, I'll help you guys. I did treat her, and do you guys want some pictures? So they gave him the pictures. Those pictures went into that public service announcement, which was never done before by the FBI. Went around the country, 18 different markets, and it ended up on the news on CNN and Fox and MSNBC, and this woman in Iceland saw it, and she called and said, I know them. They live at 303 in the Eugenia Apartments in Santa Monica. The U.S. Marshal that took that tip, when he called him back, he said, her name was Anna. Anna, I can't pronounce the last name, but she was from Iceland. And, are you sure it's them? Are you 100% sure? And she said, no, I'm not 100% sure. She said, I'm 200% sure.
She was so specific.
Well, a lot of the tips that came in were like, oh, yeah, I think I saw that guy. I was at a bar in New Orleans, or, I was in Chicago and I saw a guy that looked like him, But her tip was very specific. She said, that's Charles and Carol Gasco, exact address, and she called a couple of times. She's actually the real hero, and she did get the reward.
They actually could have caught him a number of times. By reading the book, you follow his trail. But They could have caught Whitey when he went to see The Departed in San Diego.
That's a great story that we stumbled upon. Casey actually happened to go to high school with the the San Diego sheriff's deputy who was there that day. So what happened was The Departed comes out, and I forget the year, but this San Diego sheriff's deputy was at court across the street, and they had a break. And he was from Boston, Cape Cod kid, and Richie Eaton is his name. And he said, hey, to his partner, let's go see The Departed. It's playing across the street. We got time to kill. We got a couple hours. So they go in for the early show. And they go in there and they sit, they left their guns at the courthouse because they were checked in. And they sit down, and lo and behold, in front of them is a guy. And Richie noticed him. He's like, I know it's him.
It was 2006, by the way.
2006.
Considerably earlier. They got him in 2011.
Yes, so 5 years earlier. So he sees him, and he watches him, and he sees him like nodding and laughing. And, again, Richie Eaton talked to us for this book, and, pretty interesting interview. And you can read about it all in the book. But the movie ends, and Richie says, I'll meet you outside. He goes outside and waits for the guy. Tells his partner, I think that's Whitey Bulger. No idea. He goes and he waits outside, and Bulger comes out, and Bulger looks at him. He looks at him. He was made. The cop was made. Bulger knew that guy knew who he was, and vice versa. Bulger goes and gets on a trolley, and the kid goes back to grab his gun so he can chase him, calls for backup, and long story short, Whitey disappears.
But that's the thing. He lived in plain sight, and nobody knew who he was. Only us assholes in Boston knew who he was.
Well, I think
the kid next door went to BU, right? The kid that was the property manager?
Yeah. But I think the funny thing with the thing that we have to learn from the Bulger case is that fugitives, smart fugitives, will find a way to kind of hide in plain sight. Like, everyone always assumed like Bulger was living on a tropical island in Tahiti or the Bahamas. He was in Santa Monica. Like, he was in the Gulf Coast. He was in Chicago. Like, it didn't. He just wanted to not be caught. Fugitive hunters should think a little more locally, because not everyone. Well, the other thing that happened was 9/11, and he couldn't leave the country. So that is a caveat, because if that didn't happen, Bulger probably could have come and gone from America as he wanted, and he probably would have gone to Ireland or England or Italy or Spain, wherever. And there is a lot of folks in the FBI that believe he did take those trips before 9/11, and that there is money in safety deposit boxes around the world where he planned to go. And some of the FBI guys we talked to, they want to find that money, and they want to get it because that money belongs to the victims'
family. To the victims. So the story of his capture in the apartment building, when they say you're on the edge of your seats, but the play-by-play of it is amazing. And sidebar, are you going to make a movie about this?
Well, we're working on a series, a limited series, like a TV series, like Netflix or something like that. And we have, I can't really say who we're working with, but we're working with some producers, and the producers made the movie Gran Torino, the Clint Eastwood movie, which is a great movie. And we have a director that we're hopefully about to formally partner with, and and a female producer. So we think we're heading in the right direction, but ultimately, like, this is a story that, people know The Departed. They know Black Mass. They know about the corruption, the murder, and the FBI and all that. But what they don't know is this: his life on the run, how he was caught, and how he died in prison.
That's right.
And that's the story we tell in this book.
So great.
And we do love it, and we're very proud of it. We worked very hard. I think we got a lot of new information that people don't know. So
the story about his arrest is incredible. How this, obviously this kick-ass hero FBI agent that's based out in California went, and sort of the play-by-play. It's like, no, we can't go and knock on his door. They knew that he had guns everywhere. They had to have known somebody like Whitey Bulger was going to be fully armed and loaded and ready to go. It is hilarious in such a Whitey kind of way. He's like, no, I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to even manipulate this situation right down to when you put the cuffs on me.
He did. And the beauty of this book is that, a lot of the stuff you read in this book is from Whitey's own mouth. And that's why we love this book, because we got over 70 letters that Whitey wrote himself about his life on the run, his life in prison. There's a letter that's particular scene you're talking about where we describe how he was arrested. We describe that from a letter that Whitey himself wrote. Yeah. So when you're reading that in our book, you're reading Whitey's actual words. So we think that, this book is like the actual the most accurate story because it's right from Whitey's mouth himself. You know, that whole thing, you know, he says, I'm not going to kneel down there because there's oil there. He doesn't want to get his pants dirty and all that stuff. And he like challenges the FBI guys to shoot him and all this stuff. So again, I don't want to give it all away, but he definitely was in control right to the end. And to your point, the FBI agent, Scott Garriola, who is one of the most famous FBI fugitive hunters out there, said, let's lure him down into the garage because we know he has guns. And that he was afraid that if they tried to kick in the door or whatever, that he would take Catherine hostage or just shoot his way out. They knew it was going to be a war. So they made a smart decision.
He was prepared for it because he was on guard. They would say
he had dozens of guns.
Yeah, he's out on the balcony with, you know, binoculars, keys in the joint, and they're like to the young apartment manager, that never set off any red flags to you that these people were so strange.
Paid rent and cash every month.
Charged with 19 murders, but only convicted of 11.
Right.
Why? They couldn't pin every single one on him. For one of the women, charged with the murder of 2 women, I'm quite sure there were more. You think?
If I had to guess, I would say Whitey Bulger killed a lot more than 11 people and a lot more than 19 and had a hand in a lot more than that. You know, he's a pretty dirty guy and he ran a gang and they, you know, I think they killed a lot of people. And I think John Martorano himself admitted at Whitey's trial to 20 murders. Steve Flemmi admitted that they killed at least, you know, 15 to 20 people. So Whitey Bulger personally was probably responsible for, you know, 30 to 40 to 50 or 60 or 70 murders, dead people. A lot of bodies that were probably never found, a lot of missing persons, things like that. But to the point of your question, I mean, he was convicted of 11, not convicted of 8, 2 of them being Debbie Davis and Debbie Hussey, because him and Steve Flemmi just kind of pointed the finger at each other.
Right.
I think ultimately they killed those women together. And whether he killed them or he killed them, it doesn't really matter. They killed those women. They were horrible, horrible, painful, terrible murders. It was
he's such a psychopath because he's the kind of guy, Whitey Bulger, as you write in the book, he loved animals, which I can relate to. And he was squeamish over, you know, a fish on a hook and would cry if a dog had to be, you know, euthanized. But then they're murdering people, pulling out their teeth, pounding them down to sand, and he'll go up and take a friggin' nap.
Yeah, he's a pretty classic psychopath, you know, in that way. Like he would tell other guys what, you know, he'd participate or tell guys what to do and then just go upstairs and take a nap. Like it was pretty horrible. That house in Southie, the Haunty. They killed a lot of people. Like that's, you know.
Is it still there or did they tear it down?
It was recently sold and it was sold for a lot of money because it's it's a great location, but the people who bought it, I'm assuming, don't really know what happened there because that's like poltergeist, you know. It's pretty gross.
Especially now, after all these stories that you guys have told.
I've been to the Haunty. I've been to, you know.
I did Google it and it came up, so I'm like, wow, that's really nothing to look at, but it's probably, you know, $6 million now. That's crazy, but it's in the millions for sure.
Yeah, but they were, you know, they were ruthless guys, you know, all of them. And again, like not to release Whitey from responsibility, but you know, John Martorano, Steve Flemmi, Kevin Weeks, Pat, like these guys were all killers. Like they're not nice people, and Whitey just was the boss. So who killed who and who they all killed. It was all part of their business. It was
and they were all there was this loyalty, quote unquote loyalty. But they were all spilling on each other the whole time. Kevin Weeks was like blown away by the fact that they were all snitching. Yeah. Like, really?
Yeah.
Really?
Kevin is out. He lives around here. Catherine Gregg is out. She's back in Southie. John Martorano's out. He lives in, I think, Milford. Patney's out. Lives in South Boston. Flemmi's in jail. He's going to die in jail.
Yeah, he'll never get out.
And Cadillac Frank Salami, he's in jail. He's apparently close to the end. So, you know, Whitey's dead. So, you know, you got about half of them are out, half of them are in. But I would argue that, you know, Martorano, Kevin Weeks, Patney, I don't know. I mean, he was left out of it. He was just, that's an open question. But I think all of these guys deserve to be in jail for the rest of their life. There's no world that is just where John Martorano and Kevin Weeks are like out walking around.
The trial lasted a while. There were a lot of fireworks throughout. He's convicted. he gets sent away for the rest of his life. Now, son of a bitch, Whitey Bulger lived a long life. He was old by the time he went to prison, which is unfair. I mean, he was in his mid to late 80s by the time.
Yep.
He was born in 29. Yeah, so he's pretty old as shit. He bounces around through a couple prisons, Arizona, and he seems to warm up to some kid and getting into his art. And then they move him to Florida. I think that's the chronology. And then for some reason, he goes to the absolute worst prison that you can send a guy like Whitey Bulger to, Hazleton in West Virginia. He doesn't even make it 24 hours.
Right.
One of my favorite terms of the whole story is lock in a sock. That's what did him in.
Yeah. A big reason we wrote this book was because of the murder. We knew that a lot of people were going to think that, like, the FBI set him up and all this stuff. Our investigation really shows that what happened was Whitey just wasn't a great inmate. And he pissed off the warden, and they didn't like him, and no one really cared. And they put him in a prison that he didn't belong in. And that's through, I would say, negligence and incompetence, possibly corruption, but tough to say, because I don't think someone from the FBI was like, let's put Whitey Bulger here so he's killed so he'll never talk. Like,
right.
If Whitey was going to talk, he had plenty of opportunity.
Yeah, that ship sails, man.
Right. I definitely do think when he was transferred, people were like, whatever, who cares? And
no,
when
he was old news.
The real problem was when he showed up at Hazleton, it was 10:30 at night. And the lieutenant said, saw his file and said, organized crime, OC informant. He called his warden. But he said, what do you want us to do with this guy? Where should we put him? And the guy said, I don't care. Put him in general
pop. Wow.
That was the end of it. He didn't, like you said, he didn't last 12 hours. So that was the mistake.
And two well-known Western Mass guys. I mean, they were lifers anyway. So this was nothing on them. They pulverized Whitey to the point where they didn't try to cut his tongue out or pull his eyes out. His face was just beyond ruined.
Right.
That's a part of the mystique, too.
So there's a couple of things that happened, in the reporting after he died. There was reports he was wheeled somewhere, beaten to death, and then wheeled back. And then there were reports that, like, his tongue was cut out and his eyes were cut out. There was even a report that they tried to castrate him, all that stuff. None of that happened. Here's what happened. Bulger comes in at 10:30 at night, goes to bed, 5:30 a.m., doors open for breakfast. Bulger's cellmate leaves to go get breakfast. Bulger's in bed. The two killers, the doors are open. They're walking to breakfast. They see the doors open. They walked in. They beat him to death. They leave. They go back wherever they go. And that was that. He never got out of bed. He actually laid there for a couple hours before he was found. And then the guy in his rounds was like, Bulger. And he didn't get up. He found him. His cellmate did come back and cleaned up the mess and put all the stuff into a trash bag and threw it away. And then trash comes at 8 a.m. and they took it and they put it in the incinerator. So all the evidence of whatever happened was gone. So that's why that guy was kind of in trouble. He was beaten with locks and socks, padlocks and socks.
Just like Bad Boys. Remember that Sean Penn movie? The original Bad Boys?
Yeah, great movie. So the two guys that allegedly did it is Freddie Gius and Paul DiCollegiero.
Yeah.
They're Massachusetts mobsters. Paulie DiCollegiero is doing life for the murder of a woman named Aislinn Silva. They cut her head off.
Young girl.
She was a prostitute and a drug addict who knew a lot about their gang, and they were mobsters, and they killed her to shut her up. Freddie Gius was doing life for two murders. One was orchestrating the murder of the head of the Springfield Mafia. So these are two Italian mobsters. So when Whitey walked in, they were like red meat. They knew Whitey was the guy who took down Angiulo, and the Italian Mafia in Boston over many years, and that was their opportunity. They took it. Now those two guys have not been charged, but they are both in solitary in Hazleton. That's where they've been ever since. So been almost 2 years. It's going to be interesting to see if, the DOJ ever does anything. So
do you think that the Bulger family, they're planning or they're in the process of filing a lawsuit against?
They have filed a wrongful death lawsuit. And when I talked to Billy Bulger, he was pretty clear that, like, he think what you want about my brother, but, this shouldn't happen. That was his kind of tone. And, he's right. I mean,
he's right.
Whitey Bulger is a terrible person, but we don't want to operate a society where someone goes to prison and we just throw him to the wolves.
He didn't get the death penalty,
right.
You know?
You're
they
right.
Did hammer him with a bunch of padlocks, which is
Totally
fascinating.
right. It's not the system that we set up. And again, no tears for Whitey Bulger, but I mean, come on, like, it shouldn't happen.
It's fascinating to me when I start to figure out all of the family players, the Bulger family players, and the close relationships that Whitey Bulger had with people. And nobody talked. Catherine Gregg got out of prison, completely off probation, completely free, living with her sister back in Southie, still has never talked. Why?
Because she doesn't have to. You know, Whitey was pretty clear. Like, you know, we lay it out in the book. He said, I would like her to be free. I'll confess to whatever you want, and you can give me the death penalty, but she doesn't deserve any punishment because she did nothing wrong. All she did was live with me. All she did was love me. And he said that in letters and interviews and all sorts of stuff. So he was kind of a lovelorn guy and just kind of was like, I love her, like, let her go. Long story short, she was convicted of aiding and abetting and harboring a fugitive and all that stuff. She did her 8 years. She got out. She did 6 months on a bracelet. She lived with Whitey's family in Hingham. And she served her time, and now she's done, and she lives in Southie now with her sister, and she's free and clear to go. So does she have a great story to tell? Yeah. But will she ever tell it? I don't think so.
The family doesn't talk. They're all this united front. I've never seen a united front like the Bulgers and the people that are in his closest group of people. You know, Teresa Stanley never really talked. She didn't go to tabloids or anything and sell her story. She was left penniless because she was with Whitey Bulger for so many years. He took care of everything.
Yeah.
He left her with nothing.
I mean, Catherine's got a hell of a story. Truest too, but Catherine's got a hell of a story to tell, and she could make some money off it. But I just don't think she'll ever do it.
Doesn't mean anything to her. Not enough to her.
My honest opinion, I think she loved Whitey, and she doesn't want to, you know, disgrace his memory.
They all say that, though. When you write about it in the book. You know, don't believe all that stuff. He was really good to us. I mean, you know, a lot of rapists and murderers and abusers are nice to some people.
Well, Margaret McCusker, you know, Catherine's sister, was very clear with me. She said, he loved my sister. They were a great couple. We loved him. He was a nice guy. I never saw that side of him. You know, the same old thing, you know. And Billy said the same thing. Billy said, I didn't know that side of my brother, you know, blah, blah, blah. Like, he was a good brother and all that. They all knew what was going on. Path they all chose.
There's no doubt in my mind that they had communication with one another, the whole family, because they were all there. All the siblings were always there. They were always right there when he came here, when he was going to trial. They were going to visit him. I mean, that's part of his legacy now, too, right? We know what the James J. Bulger legacy is.
For me, during that interview, I just kind of wanted to understand, like, you know, what was your life like? Why are you okay with what your brother did? You know, that's what I wanted to know. I'm not going to get him to confess. Oh, yes, I talked to my brother when he was in Detroit on, July 13th, 1994. You know, like, I just know he wasn't going to tell me that. I really just wanted to understand, like, what was it like growing up with a brother like this? What's your relationship like? And what were your feelings after he was arrested? And then what were your feelings after he was murdered? And I think all of that is in
Hunting Whitey by Casey Sherman and Dave Wedge. Okay, so this is all fascinating, and I mean that wholeheartedly because I love this stuff. I'm going to ask you one last question. I want you to think on it. Doesn't have to be the right answer. Who's going to play Whitey Bulger in the series? I have ideas.
Well, we've thought about this a lot, and there's a bunch of different people. So, like, Bryan Cranston has been mentioned.
Awesome.
Woody Harrelson, Liam Neeson, Ed Harris. Those are the big ones that we've heard, but we're open to suggestions.
This is going to come from left field. Kelsey Grammer.
Someone else mentioned him, too. He'd be great.
I love Kelsey Grammer. I'm a fan of all of his stuff. But there's a part of him that can pull off that sort of evil edge.
I don't disagree with that. That's good. I love it. So we're also thinking of like, Noreen Gleason and Catherine Gregg and all that. So do you have any female character suggestions?
Felicity Huffman. Just kidding.
Angel Wood.
I'll be in it. What do you want me to be? You want to be, I don't know, a dog walker, a radio DJ? Those are things I'm really good at.
Cop.
Be a cop. Oh, I'll be a cop.
Yeah.
Right on.
We're excited, and I thank you for all your coverage, and we were super proud of it. We worked really hard on the story, so it's the end of the saga.
Thank you so much.
Bye. I appreciate it, Angel.
Many, many thanks to Dave Wedge, co-author of Hunting Whitey, out everywhere now. It is a great read and truly the best telling of Whitey's life on the run and his capture. I referred to it quite a lot in writing this episode. Hunting Whitey by Casey Sherman and Dave Wedge. Yes, and I'm very excited about the TV series. Send any casting ideas that you might have for Whitey Bulger. After 89 years on this earth, most of those full of violence, Whitey Bulger met a brutal fate. Murdered in prison by locks and socks. He only served 5 years of a life sentence, simply not enough for the pain and suffering he caused. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Angel Wood. Follow and subscribe to Crime of the Truest Kind on Apple Podcasts and where you listen to your murder shows. Online, crimeofthetruestkind.com, Facebook and Instagram, Crime of the Truest Kind. On Twitter, @TruestKind. Ambient music by Only One, Joe Kowalski, Boston, Massachusetts. I have a number of great stories to come, so stay with me and lock your damn doors.